Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the Dmarc Bootcamp. Again, my name is Shahzad Mirza. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and talk about more detail about the Dmarc policy itself. So we're going to break down the Dmarc policy, talk about the different aspects and the different parts of the Dmarc policy. And so that way to help you get started with that Dmarc aspect and creating the policy, and you should be able to create the policy, at least have a good understanding of how to create the policy after this section. So the last half of this session, so the last about 20 minutes or so, we'll be showing you and demonstrating how to implement SPF, Dmarc, and Dkim using cloud service providers. So I have three. I'll try my best to go through all three of them. So we have Godaddy, I got Ionis 1-in-1, and I also have a Google Cloud DNS. So I'll show you, try my best to do all three of them, but you'll see when I do those, the similarities between each one of them and how very close they are. So if you're using something other than one of those three, you'll see that it's pretty much the same aspect. It's just the look and the buttons and stuff like that might be just slightly different. So let's go ahead and get started here. So just first off, to start off as a reminder in terms of what Dmarc is, right? So Dmarc is going to be that mechanism and protocol that you're going to put into place to protect your brand, right? To protect your domain and prevent your domain from being used in any type of phishing or spam type of activity, right? So you're creating your Dmarc policy, and that policy is what's going to define and say that only these systems or only these types of authorized system and authenticated systems are allowed to send messages using my domain name. And this is how this receiving side needs to handle those messages once they receive those messages. All right, so you as this domain owner needs to create the Dmarc policy. All right, nobody's creating that policy for you. You have to create that policy. You have to define the policy and define the different parts of that policy. Okay. The other half is that Dmarc verification, right? So the receiving side will have Dmarc verification enabled or turned on, right? That's something that you have to take action on in terms of enabling it. So it's typically you're going into like an email security gateway or some sort of cloud email security service provider may have these capabilities where you basically go in, find the setting, put a check mark to turn on the setting, right? We're not going to focus on the Dmarc verification side, only because each vendor does it differently, right? Then where you have to go, the location of it inside of their product is going to be different. So there's too many different products out there to go through and define what where it's located and how it's set up. Some of them may provide additional options. Some of them are probably just a simple check mark. So the best thing to do in that situation to confirm that Dmarc verification is enabled, or what you have to do or what actions you have to take in order to turn it on, check with your vendor, check with your service provider, and ask them what are the steps, what are the actions that I need to do to turn Dmarc verification on. If you're using Office 365 or if you're using Google G Suite, you have to enable it. Sorry, it's enabled by default. So they already have it turned on for you. They actually don't have a setting to turn it off. I mean, there might be somewhere really deep down, somewhere hidden, but by default, Office 365 and Google G Suite do have it turned on, and Dmarc verification is there. All right, so now some items that you need in order to go through the implementation process. So this is all overall in general, right? So remember when last week we talked about SPF and Dkim, it was recommended you need to know your mail systems and your servers that are being used, right? Because that's going to help you create your SPF. That's going to help you determine what to do and how to create Dkim keys and enable Dkim signatures on those systems, right? What are you actually using? What are you sending out using your domain name? What third-party vendors are you using as well. But then overall, what you want to have just for Dmarc purposes is you want to have admin level access to your DNS. So whether you have it or whether somebody in your organization has it, just know who has access to it, right? Who has access to your GoDaddy account? Who has access to your Network Solutions account or HostGator or your Google Cloud DNS? Who has access to that? Because that's a person who's going to be creating and putting in these records. right? They're the ones who can put in the SPF, put in the Dkim and the Dmarc records. And remember, it has to be public facing. So if you're using a cloud DNS service provider, it's most likely is going to be your public facing, but it has to be public facing, right? It's not a DNS server you're using for your internal communications within your environment. Have a list of public domains. So we have subdomains, but really have a list of all your public domains, including those subdomains, right? So a list of all public domains, including subdomains. And why you want to have that is because that's going to also help you determine, okay, which ones are being used for email, which ones are not being used for email. Because the ones that are not being used for email, you want to go through those quickly and implement a Dmarc policy at the highest level of enforcement. So that way you're preventing people from using those domains, right? So even your people and anyone outside of the organization, anyone or any fraudulent users, they're not allowed to use those domains for email activity, right? And then the ones that have email applied to it are being those domains that are being used for email purposes. For those, you're going to be carefully setting that up, right? You're going to be putting that SPF and valid Dkim keys and records into place. You're going to create an actual Dmarc policy with at the lowest level, and then work your way back up to the highest level of enforcement. So make sure you have the list of all your public-facing domains, right? Not just your subdomains. So the type of record that you're creating in DNS, the type of record you're going to be creating is a Txt record, right? So there's multiple types of resource records that you can create in DNS, but for Dmarc, it will be Txt. Now, the key thing is when you're creating a Dmarc record or a Dmarc Txt record, there's two parts to it. There's going to be the host name, or in some cases, they just call it a name, and then there's going to be the value, okay? And the value is what actually defines and what the policy is going to be. What are the different parts to the policy? So you'll have different tags within your Dmarc record, right? So you can see here like the V tag, P tag, RUA tag, RUF tag, and so on. And we're going to go through each one of these. That's what we're going to do over these next few slides. We're going to talk about each of the tags that are there, the ones that are present. Now, but before we do that, the host name, the name of the record has to be there, and it has to be underscore Dmarc. That's required. Underscore has to be there. If you put it without the underscore, the Dmarc verification side, the Dmarc verification tools and Dmarc validation tools are not going to be able to find your record. So you won't, even though you put something in there with all these values and whatnot, it's not going to be considered valued, and you're not going to have a Dmarc policy technically, right? So make sure it is underscore Dmarc. So underscore Dmarc, and Dmarc needs to be lowercase. All right. And then you're going to define your values. So there are multiple tags that you would implement. And this is just a slide with like a little cheat sheet. So this way, if you're downloading the slide deck, you can just use this slide here just to go through everything that you're looking at for the when you're creating your Dmarc policy. We're going to go through the separate slides that we create for each one. So now we broke it down into required, recommended, and optional tags and considered using. Right. So for required, these are the ones we're saying that these have to be present. They need to be present in order for Dmarc policy to work and to function correctly. Recommended and considered, those are one depending on the situation. You may or may want to not use those. And then optional, right? So the way optional will work is that you don't have to put in these tags, right? You don't need to explicitly define any of these tags, but if you do not, there are default values that will be used for those tags. All right. So the first tag that's required, V equals Dmarc 1. V equals Dmarc 1. That's the version of Dmarc that's going to be used. That has to be the first tag present in your policy. All right. That V tag cannot be somewhere in the middle. It cannot be at the end. It has to be at the very beginning. V equals Dmarc 1 and Dmarc in capital letters. All right, there is no other version, but they did this in case, somewhere down the line, if they make changes or adjustments or improvements and things like that to Dmarc, they may consider, just changing it to a different version. But right now, there is no other version. It is V equals Dmarc 1. After v equals dmarc1, what you have to do is you have to put a semicolon, right? So you're going to see as in the examples as we go along, there'll be a semicolon after each tag. Okay, that semicolon is required, is for proper syntax, and it's also defining that this is the end of the tag, this is, and then this is the next tag, right? So the next tag is p equals. That's for your policy level. That's defining your conformance and policy level. All right, and you only have 3 options. Options are none, quarantine, or reject. Okay, you can't have both or 2. You can't have none and quarantine. You can't have quarantine and reject or any combination. All right, it's only these 3 options, right? Because you can only have 1 Dmarc policy per domain. So the p tag must be second, right? And I have seen situations and cases where the p tag ends up somewhere in the middle or somewhere towards the end. I mean, technically it would work, but the problem is that, again, majority of the Dmarc validators and Dmarc verification tools that are out there are looking for the p tag to be the second tag in the policy. And if they don't see it as a second tag in the policy, they consider it an invalid policy. So this is why you need to put the p tag as the second tag, and not somewhere in the middle, not somewhere towards the end. All right, so v equals dmarc1 semicolon, p equals, and then the policy level semicolon. All right, so make sure that p tag is none, because otherwise you'll get errors, or you get some validators that won't even check or say it's incorrect, or you'll have some other verification tools basically say that you don't have a Dmarc policy and it'll ignore it. Just in case too, if people see it somewhere online, you may see somewhere it says p equals monitored. Monitor doesn't exist anymore. It's actually deprecated. It's something that they were using, but they figured, you know what, monitor and none are basically doing the same exact thing. So they removed monitor. So that's old. If for some reason you're using it, don't use it. Your only options are none, quarantine, and reject. All right, now the other key thing to take note of with this is that the p tag applies to not only the domain that you're applying and creating the policy for, but it also will apply to all the subdomains for that domain. Right, so if I'm applying a policy of reject at globalcyberalliance.org, that not only applies to globalcyberalliance.org, but also applies to all the subdomains of globalcyberalliance.org. Right, so sales.globalcyberalliance.org, marketing.globalcyberalliance.org. Right, so you can see there's a benefit to that, because then by doing that, it prevents people from using your subdomains, especially if you don't use subdomains. Right, but it could also be problematic, right? Because if you do use subdomains, right, if you do use subdomains for email purposes, by putting the top level to reject, you can cause issues for those other domains, those subdomains. But we'll talk about it. We'll talk about what you can do in those kinds of situations. Now, the other thing also is that when you put in the p tag, this does not turn on reporting. All right, all you're doing with the p tag is defining your policy level, right? You're defining your conformance level for the recipient to follow. But this does not turn on reporting. So just by putting in v equals dmarc1 semicolon, p equals none semicolon, you've done nothing, really. It's not doing anything. So there's no level of enforcement. There's no reports coming in whatsoever. So it's as if you're just taking up space at that point in your DNS. Now with the message itself, so what are these, again, as a reminder as to what these policy levels are, right? So if you're at policy level none, that's kind of like monitored only mode, right? That's what I like to call it, monitored only mode, because what you're basically doing at level 9 is you're saying like, look, I don't want to enforce my Dmarc policy right now. I want you to send me reports once I add the different tags to enable the reports. But I want to send you to send me the reports so that way I can take a look and see what's going on with my messages. Excuse me. I want to see if it's coming from only valid sources, or are you actually seeing fraudulent activity as well? Sorry, they'll see legitimate activity, but they'll also see fraudulent. You want to see all that information. And then I also want to see, you know, what's going on with SPF, Dkim, Dmarc, the things passing, things failing, things unaligned, things aligned. So that way I can make my adjustments and make my changes. Because then once I have everything fixed, then I'll move up to quarantine or reject, right? Because if there's issues, so if things are not set up correctly, so all these authentication and authorization checks fail, so SPF, Dkim, and alignment fail, and I'm at quarantine, those messages will go to spam junk folder. Right, at reject, the message is dropped and not even delivered. Right, and the only messages that we want to have those things happen to are the fraudulent messages. We want to make sure the legitimate messages actually make it to the recipient's inbox. Right, so the best practice, start at none and then gradually move your way up to reject. Don't just jump to reject. Okay, even if it's just for a few days, just check everything, make sure everything's fine, and then move your way to and then you can jump to reject. But again, remember, we have to turn on reporting. And these are the two tags that you're going to use in order to enable reporting. All right, so the V tag's first, the P tag is second. After that, the tags can be in any order. Right, so I can put RUF first and then RUA. I can go to RUA and RUF or some other tag. But the V and the P tags have to be in that order, first and second. All right, so now what are these tags? So in the previous slide, when I showed you the list of tags, we said that RUA is required when we said RUF is recommended. So technically, RUA and RUF are optional, meaning you don't have to use them. But if you do not use them, you don't get any reports. So there's no default setting for either one of these tags, right? If you don't use RUA, you don't use RUF, you do not get any reports whatsoever, right? We're saying that the RUA at minimum is required. And the reason is, again, because when you're at P equals none, you need to get those reports, because otherwise you have no way of knowing whether you're ready to go to quarantine or reject unless you get those reports. And it's the aggregate reports that we're saying are required, because that's the one that actually gives you all that information that I keep talking about. Right, that's the one that gives you the IP address of the sending server that's using your domain name, whether it's legitimate or fraudulent. That's the one that's going to tell you about SPF, about Dkim, and what's going on with those. Are they passing, failing? Are they aligned, unaligned? What domain is being used? And then also it gives you the Dmarc result as well. Right, so that's why aggregate reports we're saying are required. That's the one you want to have and put into place, so that way you can review those reports and make your adjustments, and then that's the only way you're going to know whether you're ready to go to quarantine or reject. So you put in the RUA tag. So RUA equals mail2. That mail2 is very important, colon, and then the email address you're going to send these reports to, or the recipient is going to send the reports to. The RUF tags we say it's recommended. The only reason we're saying it's recommended is because you're probably not going to get these. And you know, and there's the reason, just really quickly, the reason is mainly around privacy issues and privacy concerns. So a lot of the recipient end, they don't send these types of reports because they're actually full-blown messages. They're not technically reports, right? So next week, we'll go into more detail about both of these. So I'll actually show you what aggregate reports look like. I'll show you kinds of things in analysis, some level of analysis that you get things to look for and what actions you would take based on some of those examples. And then also show you a forensic report and what those forensic reports look like as well. So for forensic reports, the way you would put this in is RUF equals mail2 colon, and then the email address you're going to send it to. All right, so those are the two tags that you should put in. RUA, definitely use it. RUF, it's up to you. If you don't want to use it, it's not going to hurt anything, but there are benefits to having it in place in case you do get any of those reports. Right, so the way you do this, again, RUA equals mail2 colon, and then the email address. Now the email address you should be using, don't use a personal work email address. Right, so I wouldn't put in smirza@company.com or smirza@globalcyberalliance.org, because what could potentially happen is, especially with aggregate reports, you can get a ton of aggregate reports, especially if your organization sends a large amount of emails to multiple domains. You can get a large amount of reports, and the next thing you know, all you're getting in your mailbox or your inbox is a ton of reports and everything else is hidden in between those reports. So send it to a generic account. And the other reason also is that, remember, Dmarc policy is public, right? You're putting it on your public DNS so anyone can find your Dmarc policy and then therefore find your email address in that policy. Right, so use something like dmarc@company.com. Some organizations split the two reports out. They create a dmarc-RUA and a dmarc-RUF, right? But that's up to you. But don't make it a distribution group either, right? Because a distribution group, the idea is the message goes to that email address and then it distributes it to various people. Create an inbox. So create an actual inbox for this email and let people give access to people to that inbox so they can get whatever reports or review any reports that they need to. You can also have multiple email addresses in this as well. So the way you do that is not by using multiple RUA or RUF tags, because the tag can only be used once. What you do is you separate each email with a comma, and then make sure each email address has the mail to : in front of it. So that's what the last example is showing you. So RUA equals mail to : the first email address, comma, mail to : the second email address, and then semicolon. How many email addresses should you be using? You really shouldn't be using more than 3 or 4, right? Because some validators tend to stop at 3. Right, and then the 4th one, they won't send in the reports. The 4th or 5th or 6th, they won't send in your reports to those. Right, then that's why we say use a generic account and just send the email to a generic account and then give people access to that generic account. The other thing is also with these reports, they can only be sent by default to an email address for that domain that you're creating the Dmarc policy on. So if the Dmarc policy is for company.com, the email address needs to be @company.com. Can you send to someone outside of your organization or outside of that domain? Yeah, you can. Yes, you can. But there's additional actions that need to be taken by that external recipient in order to accept the messages, right? Because otherwise you can put in any email address you want and then start spamming or DOSing in essence to people with all of your reports, right? So there's a safeguard mechanism in place to say, okay, wait, you can't just send to anybody outside of your organization. You have to put in additional DNS records. So the third party would have to put in additional DNS records in order to accept those messages. Otherwise, they won't be able to get it. All right. So RUA tag we're saying is required, RUF tag is recommended. And we'll go into much more detail about the reports next week. Now there's other tags. So the remaining tags that we're talking about, these are all optional tags, right? If you do not actually define them in your policy, they will go and use the default value for that tag, right? So if you don't type in FO equals, it's going to revert and default to a specific value. Now the FO tag is only going to be used if you actually have the RUF tag in place. Excuse me, and the reason for that is that the FO tag is basically to say what triggers those failure reports. So what's the mechanism that's going to trigger the sending of those reports? And your options are 0, 1, D, and S. The default is 0. So if you do not put in FO equals, it's going to always use FO equals 0. All right. So at 0, it's going to generate a report if all underlying authentication mechanisms fail to produce an aligned pass result. All right. If 1 is if any underlying authentication mechanisms produce something other than an aligned pass result. So the difference really is that you're saying everything. So if the first one is 0, so everything is producing an aligned pass, is failing to produce an aligned pass. So Dkim alignment is failing, SPF alignment is failing. So both fail. 1 is either or. So if either one or fails to trigger this. For D, it's only if it's a Dkim issue. S is only if it's an SPF issue. Right. The most common one I see tends to be 1. FO equals 1, or people leave it out. ADKIM and ASPF. This is also optional. You don't have to use these, so you don't have to define it. If you do not define it, the default value is going to be R, which is a relaxed alignment. And then S is strict alignment. So what does this mean by alignment? So if you remember last week when we talked about SPF and Dkim alignment, right? SPF alignment was saying that check the envelope from, does the envelope from address, domain address match the from address? It does, that's aligned. If it does not match, it's unaligned, right? For Dkim, if the D in the domain in the Dkim signature domain matches the from domain, then you're aligned. If it's not, does not match, then it's unaligned. Right, and the default is relaxed because what they're allowing you to do with relaxed alignment is that if you have subdomains and the subdomains, you know, using the same signature for your domain, your top level domain for your subdomains. So, I mean, it doesn't exactly match, but since it's within the same domain, we're saying, okay, it's allowed. We'll let it go. So we're relaxing the alignment. Right, but if it's completely different domains, it's still a fail, even under relaxed. Strict alignment, you're basically saying, no, it has to match exactly, right? It can't be a subdomain and the top level domain. It has to be a top level domain and the top level domain. The sub level domain has to match the sub level domain. So, you know, basically letter by letter, it has to be the same. So be careful with strict alignment. How do you know whether you could use strict alignment or not? Review the reports, right? The reports are going to tell you what your alignment is and whether it's aligned or not aligned. It's going to tell you which domain is being used. Right, so that information is going to be in those reports. So that's why reports are so critical and so important to go through and do analysis. Majority of the time, though, I have seen only people use relaxed. I haven't seen too many people use strict. I mean, it has been used, and it, you know, but I haven't seen it too often. The next two tags are RF and RI. So RF starts to report format, and RI is for reporting interval. So what are these used for? So by default, all the reports come in one format, which is AFRF, which is abuse report format. You do have an option of using IODEF. When should you consider using IODEF? It really depends on what you're using to ingest these reports, right? So if there's some SIM tools or some type of logging type devices that can actually consume these reports, may ask you to use IODEF. But that's only if that's required. But I mean, I personally haven't seen anyone use IODEF, but that doesn't mean it's never been used, right? I've actually never seen, I have yet to see the RF tag actually being used in a Dmarc policy. But again, doesn't mean it can't be used. I'm sure people have used the IODEF version and for whatever reporting and consumption purposes. So I gave the RSC values just so you can go through. If you really want to look at the differences between the two, you're welcome to do so. But for time's sake, we're not going to dive into the differences. RI's reporting interval. The reporting interval is defined in seconds. So what this is doing is defining that how often these reports should be sent to you and what's the amount of information within that report. So the default is 84,600, so 24 hours. So within a 24-hour period, you'll get reports. Right? So it's not going to be like exactly you're going to get reports exactly at this time every day, right? The reports will typically come throughout the day, but it's going to say this is the interval, this is the 24-hour period of information that we saw, and so this is what we're providing to you in this report. So if you lower the value, so if you go 12 hours, your report's going to have 12 hours worth of information, right, and so on. So people have adjusted this. I've seen a lot of people actually lower the number, and the reason they lower the number is because they want to get reports sooner, because they're looking to get to quarantine or reject relatively quickly, right? Maybe they're seeing a lot of spam activity. They're getting a lot of reports that people are using their domains, so they'll reduce it. So that way they can get the reports sooner. They can get get a better period of time, make the adjustments that they need to make to SPF, add in the appropriate Dkim keys or as needed, and then move to quarantine or reject, and then most cases then they'll take off the reporting interval tag and just let it be the default. Then there's the PCT tag, which is also optional again. So if you do not, what the PCT tag is going to do is going to define the percentage of messages impacted by the Dmarc policy. Right, so your options for this tag is anywhere between 0 to 100, default being 100. So if you do not have the PCT tag in, that means that 100% of this Dmarc policy applies to all messages. So sorry, that the policy applies to 100% of the messages. Now, what you can do is you can obviously put in PCT equals 5, PCT equals 50, and that means, so if you put in 5, that means only 5% of the messages are impacted by this Dmarc policy. 50, right? 50% of the messages are impacted by this Dmarc policy. So which 5% are impacted? Which 50% are impacted? And what, which 95% are not? Which 50% are not? How do you dictate that? How do you define that? You don't. You can't. The policy doesn't do that. So this is why, it's up to you if you want to use it. I don't see any real major benefit in terms of using this, because it's really, if you're deciding to go to quarantine or reject, that's most likely because all of your messages or everything looks to be correct, everything is working, right? So you might as well just stay at PCT equals 100. Don't even use the PCT tag at that point, since you can't control which messages are being impacted and which ones are not. But if you do use it, just be wary of the things like if you put in P equals quarantine and PCT equals 0, that's basically P equals none, right? And if you do with reject and PCT equals 0, that's quarantine, right? So there's no reason to use 0. Really, there's no reason to use a 1 either. But just be wary of that fact in case you do put in PCT equals 0, that this is the level of impact. You just reverted back to none, or you reverted back to quarantine. And then the last tag we're going to talk about is the SP tag. So this is also optional, but you do really want to consider this one and whether it makes sense for your environment. And the reason for that is, remember the P tag, right? The P tag, P equals none, P equals quarantine, P equals reject. That applies to the top level domain and your sub-level domain. But you could run into issues, especially if you have subdomains that are being used for email, right? So that's why they created the SP tag, because the SP tag is for your subdomain policy level, right? And it's the same, the policy levels are the same as the P tag. So it's SP equals none, SP equals quarantine, SP equals reject. So same set, same values. But it's a situation that you're in and whether you need to use it or not, right? So one example is that when you're working with P equals none, right? What's preventing people from using a subdomain of your top level domain? And right now in this situation, no, nothing if you use P equals none. But what you can do is you can add SP equals reject. So that way, while you're working on your top level domain and fixing it and making adjustments, no one's using sub level domain versions of your domain for spam and phishing purposes, right? So that's why you put in SP equals reject. And it has happened to people. Like, people have been working on it with the P tag, and they would reach out to us and say, hey, we're still working on our policy, but all of a sudden we're seeing all these spam messages, but they're using subdomains, and we don't use subdomains, right? And we clarify that. Are you absolutely sure you don't use any subdomains? And like, yes, we know that for a fact that we don't. So I said, okay, then add the SP equals reject at the end of your policy, and that will prevent those and stop those from happening, right? This has happened to quite a few various types of organizations. But the other thing is, could be the flip side, right? You have subdomains and you're actually using subdomains for email. And the problem is now you're ready to switch your top level domain to reject or to quarantine. But if you do that, what's the problem you're going to face, right? The sub-level domains they don't know about Dmarc, they don't know that they don't need to put that in, but you go to reject and quarantine, then the messages being sent from those subdomains are going to be rejected and quarantined. And that's a problem. Right, so that's where again, now you have the option to put in SP equals none, right? So that way your top levels are rejected or quarantined, so you're protected at top level, you put in enforcement, but then your sub-level domains, you're saying the policy is set to none. And then what do they do at the sub-level domain, right? Each one that is responsible for email and sending out email, they'll create their own SPF, they'll create their own Dkim, and they'll create their own Dmarc policy. right? And then they move their Dmarc policy up to quarantine or reject, which overrides the SP equals none. But you want to make sure you're working together on those. So it's the different IT departments and things like that, because once all the subdomains have moved their way up to reject or quarantine, right? You want to change your SP tag to reject, right? Because otherwise those the subdomains that have their own Dmarc policy are protected, but any other variation or other subdomain that's not actually used for email can still be used by leaving it as SP equals none, right? So once all those subdomains are ready and they put in what their policy is, the subdomain policy overrides the top level domain, okay? Change your SP tag to reject or remove the SP tag. So the default for SP, so if you do not use the SP tag, the default is the P tag, right? Because the P tag applies to your top level and all your sub-level domains. So whatever your P tag is, that's what the SP tag will take if you do not define the SP tag. All right. So those are all the different tags that are available to you with Dmarc, right? Will there be new tags? There maybe, will they remove some of those? I hope they at least remove the PCT tag, but right now, for now, it is there. But just, as of right now, there are no, the working group is working on different things. Right now, but as of right now, everything is what we've talked about is how it is and how it's going to remain for quite some time. All right, so I only saw that one question, which I answered. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and show you how to create some DNS records. So, I mean, here I just put one-on-one Google Cloud DNS, but I realized I have a GoDaddy account as well, so I can actually show you in GoDaddy. So let me switch here to Google Chrome. All right, so here on Google Chrome, hopefully you all can see this. So I have Office 365, and I'm just going to use that as a base point to help me out with, creating some records and some tools and systems and things like that. But then I have here is my DNS Manager for GoDaddy, so globalcyberalliance.eu. Here on ionis.com, let's see, let's use one that's not actually live. So GCA aid, whoop, and it logged me out. So let me get back in. And okay, so that's what we're going to use. I'll go to the DNS tab. And then we have here got.dmarc.org and Google Cloud Platform. So I'm probably going to use this, but then I'm going to show you in GoDaddy and then show you in Ionis 101 some other things that we can do, in terms of setting up and protecting these records. Okay, so let's start off with, since we're here, Google Cloud Platform, let's use this one first. So here we have our standard records. We have CNAMEs, A records, Star of Authority, TXT, MX records, and so on. So what we need to do first is create an SPF record. So when I'm creating an SPF record in this situation, I'm going to just click on Add Record Set and then start creating my SPF record. So if you remember from last week with SPF, when you're creating and defining the DNS name, there is no name that you're defining, right? You're supposed to keep it null or at, right? So we leave it blank because by default, we want to use got.dmarc.org. The type of record it needs to be, it's a TXT record. Right, and time to live, I'll leave it for 5 minutes, but typically in most cases, the time to live and the default in most cloud service providers is actually 1 hour, which is fine. You can leave it for it, but I'll leave it at 5 minutes. And then in here is where I'm going to create my record, right? So now the quotes, it's going to depend on the system that you use. Some of them will automatically append the quotes. Some of them will error out if you don't put the quotes. So let's see what happens if I don't put in the quotes. So V equals SPF1, right? And I know I have MX records, and I'm going to say -all. So now it's giving me warnings as I put it in here. So it's saying is you're lacking quotes. So it's saying that you need to put in quotes. So it's requiring me to put in quotes. Whoops. right? So it's saying you have to use quotes. That's what's the default in there. Some systems will automatically put it in. That's why I'm going to show you some of these that don't want, that's why I want to show you some of these other systems. So now I've created it, or put it in. I'm going to hit create, but it's going to error out again. Because in Google Cloud Platform, what it looks for if you have a TXT record already in place, right? So it's got dmarc.org. There's already a TXT here, and it actually puts all the information and consolidates it together. So what I actually needed to do was go in here and edit this one and add a line for v equals SPF1 MX dash all. Oops, spelled correctly, right? And then save it, right? Because it adds it like this. This is how Google works, right? So, but if I'm using something like Ionis, right? So I have one here already, so I'll delete it just to show you how we do it here. And in fact, I'll delete the Dmarc. And what we basically do in here is to add it, you click on add record. So similar to what we did Google, we add it. But here the difference is Ionis actually gives you SPF. They say it's a text record, but they actually give you an SPF option. And the reason they do that is because they try to help you create your SPF record, right? So they say, here's the SPF text record creating. What's the host name that you want? We want it to be null. What's the value we want? In this case, we're going to say v equals SPF1 dash all. Now here you see I don't put the quotation marks, but if you look at the bottom here in the preview, it actually adds the quotation marks for you, right? So Google errored out and said, no, you got to put the question marks in. Ionis one-on-one and some other ones like Godaddy will do that. They'll say, they'll put it in and automatically add it for you. Now, why did I put in SPF v equals SPF1 dash all? The reason I did that is because I'm creating an empty SPF. We don't use this domain GCAA.net for email purposes. So I want to put in a protection mechanism to say, look, there are no servers authorized to use this domain for mail purposes. So I'm putting in v equals SPF1 dash all. Right, so it's an empty SPF. And we click save, and then it adds the record appropriately. So it's the same thing then with Godaddy. Right, so I already have one here. But the way I would do it, if I were to add it in, I would click on add, right? And then under add, choose TXT, define the host, which is just going to be @ and then put in the text value of v equals SPF1. And you see the TTL, the time to live, is 1 hour by default, which is fine. You don't need to change it. You don't need to reduce it to 5 minutes. Right? But I'm not going to create this because you can only have one SPF record, right? Only one SPF. So you see how this kind of varies and differentiates between the three, but majority of them will follow what the Godaddy will look like. You'll actually have to create a TXT record. So if you're using like Cloudflare, you have to click on add, and it actually pops up a similar box like this. You would choose add, TXT, give it the name, give it the text value, and then go through the rest of the process. All right. So then when I need to make changes to this, right, because so I'm using Office 365 with dmarc.org, right? So what do I need to do here? Because if I go into settings and domains in Office 365, here's dmarc.org. It says it's healthy. It's not. So it's because the status is going to error out. Yep. So it's erroring out here, saying there's an invalid entry, right? Because there's nothing that my SPF says v equals SPF1 MX dash all. It doesn't have the include SPF protection.outlook.com. So what do I do? And this is an error that most people make. What they end up doing is they'll copy this, they go into their policy, and they'll go edit, and they'll add an item, paste that in there, right? And then this is what you don't do, right? Now you have two SPF policies. That's a problem. And I've seen this as a common error. You don't do that. What you need to do is add only the part that you need into here, right? The policy says it has, as we have v equals SPF1, we have the dash all. What don't we have? We don't have the include SPF protection.outlook.com. So we only need that part, and you add it to that. right? So you add it to your existing SPF, right? If you're using something else like Salesforce, put in include spf.salesforce.com. And I don't think that's the right one for Salesforce, but double check with Salesforce to make sure that's right. Right? Whatever your vendor tells you, whatever the third party tells you to add in, that's what you add. Don't look up their SPF and copy their SPF. Don't do that. Follow specifically what they say in their instruction guides, right? Because when you look up their SPF, that's the SPF value for their domain, right? And then those are servers that are used for their domain. They typically have separate servers for customers, right? So make sure you follow the instructions, right? So I just click on save, and there you go. Now my SPF record is in place. So now if I go back here, have it recheck everything, it should eventually you should say okay. I've noticed with Google DNS sometimes takes time, right? And then this is the same thing with Ionis, right? So what I would go in here is find my SPF record. If I were actually now to start using this, if I actually had MX records, I would just go in and make the adjustments here, right? Because I mean, technically there are MX records here, which I probably should delete, but I can go in here and just say, okay, well, you know what? We're actually using it. Just add in MX, click save. And now it allows for these mail servers to be used. Okay, so that's where you just make these adjustments in SPF. Same with Godaddy, right? Just make the adjustments. Click on edit, add in what you need to add in. So that's how you handle SPF. So one record per domain, right? So if you have subdomains and those subdomains are being used for email, have an SPF for each of those subdomains. Now, what about Dkim? So let's do Dkim next. So now, depending on the type of provider that you're using, your Dkim value can either be a CNAME record or it can be a Txt record, right? Depends on what you're using. Most third-party providers are going to have you use a CNAME record, right? Because they're the ones who wants to be, they're going to be responsible for maintaining the private and public keys for you. They just want you to point to this domain where the public key resides for you, right? But if you're using like on-prem type systems and things like that, there's most likely to be a TXT, right? So most likely going to be TXT records that you're going to create. So I'll show you examples of both of those two. So we'll use, again, Office 365. So in Office 365, we can find out is, okay, where is the Dkim Setup? And where you do the Dkim options. So if you're using the new version of Office 365, the new admin console, this is the route you're going to go. If you're using the old portal, right, because they have the old portal, and unless you revert to the new one, it's not, or unless you enable the new one, it's not, you're not going to see this. The old one is everything's under Exchange. So you go to Exchange, Protection, and then under Protection, you go to Dkim. In this case, they moved it to Security. Under Security, you get to go to Threat Management. And under Threat Management is the option for Policy. And then under Policy, you'll have an option for Dkim, right? So Security, Threat Management, Policy, Dkim. And when you click on it here, this is going to show you your list of domains where you can manage your Dkim domains, right? So now in this case, the way we have it set up, it's not going to work because Dmarc.org doesn't have Dkim keys. And what we have to actually do is we have to go in order to get these Dkim keys here, you actually have to go into PowerShell. So using PowerShell, you have to connect to Exchange Online, go into Exchange Online, and then manage your keys from there, right? So you set up the keys and then everything that, then you'll have the option here to rotate and enable it. All right, so just to give an example here, so if I choose globalcyberalliance.org, this is what it should actually look like, right? Now, again, this is still not going to work, and the reason it's not going to work is because the records are not in place yet. Because what you actually have to do is you actually have to create the records first, And once the records are created, then you can come back in here and enable it. And it's a safeguard that third-party providers do, right? Because you don't want to start signing messages and there's nothing to check against. Because if there's nothing to check against, I could consider that, some recipient sides can consider that a failure, right? There's a signature here, but that domain doesn't have DKIM, so there's a problem. There's an error. Could this be a fraudulent message? They could mark it as and reject that message or quarantine that message. So you have to create two records, selector 1 and selector 2. Right, and if anyone has experience with Office 360 in the past and you actually went through this whole process of DKIM, in the past, they actually told you what the value of the records would be. Now they're telling you what the name of the record is going to be. They don't tell you the values. So the selector 1._domain key, that's the name of the record, not the value of the record. Okay, so be cautious about that. So what we'll do is we're going to pretend this is global cyberline, or sorry, gotdmarc.org. So what I do is go into gotdmarc.org. I'm going to add a record set, right? Yes, I have a CNAME here, but the CNAME, the name of this record is auto discover, right? The name of the record that I need to create is selector 1._. So I'm going to create a new CNAME record. So in here, I'm going to put in selector 1._ domain key. Right, I'm going to change this to a CNAME, and I'll still leave the TTL to 5. And then in here is where I'm going to put in what the actual value is. Now, there are instructions on how to do it. We're going to link to those resources and have those resources available to you. So you don't have to try to remember how I'm showing it to you here. So here, what I'm going to just show is, because since I know what to do, so I put in selector 1 dash, because it's always going to be selector 1 dash. And after here, it's going to be, typically it's the name of the domain. But if you're not sure what it is, what you can do is check the MX records. So the MX record will tell you what's the GUID that your unique ID that you need to use. And in this case, it's gotdmarc-org. Right, so make sure you look at the MX record. It's the first part of that MX record. So selector 1 dash gotdmarc-org _, domain key dot, and then it's always going to be the one that's the default signing domain for your organization. So GCA 1.onmicrosoft.com. This is the key that it's actually pointing to and using. That's the one that's always there. That's the actual one that's actually being used and actually being signed if you don't go through this process. Oops. So I create this, and there you go. Then I would add another one. All right, because for selector 2, oops. Maybe a CNAME, put this in, and create. All right, so now I have my two selectors. Remember, great for domain keys, you can have multiple domain keys. You're not restricted to just one. And it's the same thing that I would do with, like, if we're using Godaddy, right? I would click on add, select the name, CNAME, right? Create the host, selector 2 _, domain key, or it was 1, right? And you point it to the appropriate domain, click on save, and there's my selector. And then I would do the same thing and repeat the same thing for selector 2. All right. Let me actually delete it. The same thing with Ionis. It's also the same thing. It's not any different from Godaddy. You create the CNAME, put in the host name and where it's pointing it to, and so on. All right. So you can see it's not, we just follow what the, in this case, I just showed you how to do it. But, typically if I didn't know what to do, I would either ask or I would go up and look in Microsoft's TechNet type guides and the help guides to see what I need to create, because they actually have pretty good instructions. So when you're using a third-party vendor, follow their instructions, right? They're going to specifically tell you. Some cases, like when you're using things like MailChimp, HubSpot, Constant Contact, and so on, they will give you specifically what the keys are. Specifically what are the records and what type of records you're going to create, right? SendGrid will give you those CNAME records. And then you have to make sure once these are in place, right? Once these are in place, then you will go back to your domain, click on enable, right? Don't forget this last step. So it's either enabling it or validating it, depending on what you're using. So don't forget that last step, because a lot of people will go to the point of creating the record and they'll be like, why is Dkim still not working? Because you did not turn on signing. You didn't validate your domain. You didn't validate that the records actually exist. All right, so that's important to take that into account. All right, so now let's create Dmarc record. So how do I create a Dmarc record? There's nothing in Office 365 that's going to tell me what to do. The TechNet will have Dmarc stuff in there, but it's just their guides, right? We're just going to go ahead and do it since we talked about it for the first 30 minutes of today's session. So we're going to create our DNS record. So remember, the DNS record has to be _Dmarc, right? That has to be the name. The underscore has to be present, and Dmarc in lowercase. What's the record type we're creating? TXT. Right, I'll still stick with the default the TTLs. And then here's where I got to put in the information. So again, remember with text, Google requires the quotation marks. So you're going to put in quote v equals Dmarc1, right? Because that has to be the first tag. Then the second tag has to be the P tag. We'll start off at none, right? Because we should always start off at none just to make sure. And RUA equals mail2: the email address you're going to send the reports to. Oops, spelled correctly, mail2, right? And then I'll do RUF as well. Right, and that's it. I hit create. Oh, sorry, there's already Txt Records, that's right. No, wait, do I already have one? Do I still? Huh. _Dmarc. Txt. Equals Dmarc 1 semicolon P equals none semicolon. All right, well, I'm not sure what happened there. But there's my record. And then when I need to make changes to it, I just edit that record, right? So I want to get RUF reports. So I'm going to put this in, change that to an F, and then save it, right? I find out from that, we're getting spam messages using our domain, our subdomain. So I put in SP equals reject. So you see, I'm just keep adding to it and then saving it. Right? If I'm done with it, can change my policy to reject. I'm good, right? So remember, only one Dmarc policy per domain. Now, what if that domain is not being used for email, right? So like this one here. So GCA.net, we don't use this for email purposes, right? So these records here shouldn't be here. So what do I do in that situation? So what do I do is so I already created, so we talked about this one with SPF. So I just create a blank SPF, and that's just, again, another safeguard for people who are just doing SPF checking, right? So then what I do is I'm going to create another record, add a record. It's going to be a TXT record, right? Because it says right here, such as Dmarc or Dkim. It's going to be _Dmarc that I'm using, but what I'm going to put for the value, v equals Dmarc1 semicolon P equals reject. And I tend to like to say, okay, you know what? I do want to get the reports, so I'm going to have the reports sent to this email address. So I want the RUA, so it shows right here. Right, and you see it automatically puts in the quotation marks as well, so I don't have to do anything there. So I click on save, and then now I'm sending reports to smears@dmarc.org. Right, now technically these reports are not going to be received by this email address because I don't have it set up to accept the reports from GCA.org or to GCA.net. And the same thing here. So I did the same thing here. So I have it set up here. So v equals Dmarc1, and I'm having it sent to an actual, a different domain. All right, and that's all you have to do. And then you just have to make the changes and adjustments that you need. In most cases, when you're working on this, you could actually make adjustment and changes to your SPF, and you're going to be adding and removing Dkim keys most likely. Right, your Dmarc is only going to, the only time you're going to probably change it is if you have to change the P value or the SP tags at some point in time. So those are the most changes you can do. So those are all the things you can do in setting it up and using these different types of cloud providers that are available to you. So at this point now, it's recommended if you can go ahead and start implementing it. Put in a Dmarc policy if none. Go put it through your change control, right? Because all you need is a record name underscore Dmarc and then the values. Make sure you have the proper email address, the generic email address and email account set up, so that way you can send reports to that. And if you need any help or any guidance, so if you want to just check, hey, look, this is what I'm putting in, is this correct? Reach out to us. But start off at P equals none, okay? And if anyone hasn't implemented Dmarc and you're looking to get the certificate at the end of the boot camp, as long as you go through all the five live sessions for each week. So each week, one session each week for the full live sessions, and you implement Dmarc by June 5th, I believe it is, on the policy level of none, we'll give you an additional 3 credits. That's only if you didn't do Dmarc when we started the boot camp. Just as a reminder, next week is the reporting week. So we'll talk about ongoing management. So that's specifically talking about the aggregate and forensic reports. These are the different things that you look for. This is what the reports look like. These are some of the tools you can use to review those reports. Okay, and we'll give through some examples of like, this is what an aggregate report looks like in a readable format and some of the actions that you may need to take. So that's next week on May 26th. And then our wrap-up session and additional email security mechanism will be on June 2nd. Right, so we have 2 more weeks left until the end of the boot camp. So I know we went over by 4 minutes, seems to be a trend. We'll see if it continues for the next few weeks, but if you do have any questions, I'll stay on for a few more minutes. Don't think that, now that we're done here that I won't answer any questions. If you do have questions, feel free to ask them. If not, feel free to contact me via email, or contact us via email, or post the questions on our community forum. Happy to answer those questions and help out in any way you can with your Dmarc journey. But if there are no questions, then thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week. So I'll stay on for another minute in case there are any questions. If not, then we'll end the session. All right, I don't see any questions. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week.